Hello there guys. In this video I'm going to be building this grassy hill terrain piece, which is the first terrain piece I've built for my Scalextric layout. Scalextric is 1/32nd scale, so I've used a lot of the skills here that I've learnt in my 1/35th scale modelling for vehicles and dioramas in order to get the best result I can. So this terrain piece is designed to go around one of the corners on my track, and it's designed as a combination of a scenic piece and a retaining wall. So you can see I've cut the base there to the right shape for the track to go alongside it, and then I've built up this box here and sort of braces inside it and so on, and then put that curved wall there which will go along the side of the track. Hopefully it will look a little bit like this image here from Brands Hatch in 1975, where you've got the track and then the retaining wall, behind that the earth, and on top of the earth mound you've got the spectators. That's the kind of thing I'm going for. So I need to fill this space here with something lightweight, and the best thing I found for that was simply some screwed up brown packing paper. This is made from 6mm XPS insulation foam, and all of the joints are held together with PVA glue. Typically while the glue is setting up I also use some pins to hold everything in position, particularly with that curved wall. Also I have to bear in mind that the Scalextric track itself is 8mm tall, and therefore the bottom 8mm of my terrain piece will be hidden. On top of that, simply to provide some rigidity, I use some toilet tissue and some watered down PVA glue, and simply put it over the top, quite similar in a way to what I was doing for the water style bases that I made for my ships and for my X-Wings. Just putting the glue on, letting it seep into the paper, spreading it around with a brush if I need to, and using multiple layers of the tissue paper. The idea here is it will dry fairly solid. I'm not too worried about the texture of it, although a lot of the pattern will disappear anyway, but it will provide the base for the next layer. And there you go, you can see it's still drying there, but that's the kind of shape that I want, that hillside there where some spectators can stand. And here, once it's dry, you can see how it will fit onto my Scalextric track. So here's my hairpin, and it just slots there at the edge of the table, like so. So that vertical surface there will provide a retaining wall, like on a real circuit. And the way that I'll stop that terrain piece going flying is it will be attached to the table with some Velcro dots. I'm not going to glue it down permanently because I might want to change it later. And there you can see a couple of my 1/32nd scale Scalextric figures, just to give you an idea of the scale. Here you can see that the dried surface has a little bit of play in it, which is fine, but it is nevertheless solid. Now to get the texture I want, which is going to be the basis for a sort of a grassy hill with some dirt paths, I'm going to use this AK Terrain's light earth paste. But before I do that, I'm going to take a couple of offcuts of XPS foam. Yes, I keep even small pieces like this around. I'm going to sand down their edges to make them smooth. And these will become rocks on the hillside later. So here you can see that acrylic terrain paste. That wasn't a new pot, I've used some on something else already. And I'm going here for the thinnest covering possible over this hillside. I'm not using this texture paste to build up terrain features. That was what the toilet paper was for. This should be just thin enough to cover absolutely everything. Obviously the main reason to do that is it saves the acrylic paste, but also the thicker you put it on, the longer it will take to dry, and the higher the likelihood that it will crack. There are the rocks that I made earlier. I'm putting those in now so that the acrylic paste will act as a bonding agent for those. You can see as I move on to the second half that the acrylic paste on the first half has already started to dry. And then down here on the flat area, I didn't put any toilet paper under this, but I still did put the terrain paste, and I'm stippling this here to break up the flatness of that piece. Here you can see that the paste has dried, and it has cracked in a couple of areas, but that's not a huge problem. One thing I did notice that I hadn't experienced before is that the paste dried and it sort of pulled up the foam slightly, so it's no longer dead flat. So if I was going to do this again, I guess just put the paste on and then somehow weight the foam down while it dries. That's a bit hard, of course, because anything you put on top of the foam is going to get the paste in it and make an imprint on it, but I'll see what I can do next time. Now, I did make a bit of a schoolboy error on this next piece because I tested my rattle can primer on a test piece of foam and it was fine. So I got stuck in, I sprayed the primer all over my actual model and it promptly started to eat away at the foam. In particular, as you can see here, along this retaining wall. And you can see it looks a bit of a mess. However, I'm not super worried about that. I let it all settle down and then I took some of this AK Terrain's asphalt texture, which, truth be known, is not that dissimilar to the dry earth texture. Now, I've had mine for a while and it seems to have dried out a little bit. So I threw some water in there, gave it a good stir, and applied it onto the wall, right across, even on the unaffected sections. And I found the easiest thing to do was to give it a light coat and then take a kitchen towel and spread it in a horizontal direction. And I think actually that enhances the wall somewhat and gives it more of a rough concrete texture. A lot of these track features, like the walls and the curbs and so on, they look nice in the grandstands, but if you get up close they're often pretty scratty. Concrete gets taken out of them and they don't get repaired, they just get painted over. So you end up with sort of layers and layers of paint and things like that. And they don't look particularly good when you're right next to them. So I think this fits in quite well with that. To provide a base coat for the terrain, I went over everything with some cheap artist acrylic paint. This is burnt sienna, or is it burnt umber? I can't remember now, burnt umber actually I think. This is just to provide a base for some light airbrushing later and of course for the static grass. Here you can see that I've airbrushed all of those walls in white. A combination of white not being an easy colour to get coverage with and the fact that the material is a little bit absorbent meant I needed a lot of paint on that, and even so, even then the white's not perfect. I think with hindsight it might have been better to go over with a cheap acrylic white paint first and then airbrushed afterwards. But such is life. Now what I'm aiming for here is for the retaining wall and the wall at the rear to have some classic advertising on them. A little bit like these images here from Brands Hatch in the 70s, with sort of the Shell logo, Dunlop, the Daily Mail, things like that, giving it a bit of a 60s, 70s vibe. I don't really have any spare decals in the right size or the right logos to do that. I could just get these logos and print them out on printer paper and stick them on, but I don't think it would look quite right. Equally, I could use some decal paper and print my own decals, but I think the texture of these concrete walls, especially the one down here that I messed up, would mean the decal wouldn't sit really well and the logo wouldn't look quite right. So what I've gone for instead is some paint masks, and I've made these using a new purchase I have, which is the Cricut Joy Extra machine. It's like a cutting machine. I will do a separate video that shows you how I use that, for not just for things like this, but also for aircraft roundels and serial numbers and so on. But for now I use the machine to cut some masks out of this black vinyl that comes with the Cricut. In the future I'll try using some Tamiya masking sheet, but I thought it best to stick with the default materials for now. So here you can see me masking up with a BP Long Life logo. The vinyl is actually really good. It's got quite a strong adhesive, but it doesn't seem to have brought any paint off. And it seems to be quite resistant to curling up on itself, even with long masks like this Long Life one here. And I've got to say, I was really happy with this when I pulled this masking off. I absolutely love the look of these logos. I think in the future, if I had something to stick the masks back onto, I could reuse them for multiple different logos, or in multiple different locations, should I say. But in this case, I just discarded them the first time. But yes, I was properly pleased with this, and I think with some weathering, these will look really good indeed. This is definitely a tool I'm going to enjoy learning about. My next step was to apply the static grass, and to do that I needed to put some PVA glue down wherever I want the grass to be. That's going to be most of the hillside, but I do want a slightly patchy effect rather than a lawn effect. I haven't diluted the PVA glue here, although I have spread it fairly thin. Now my original plan was to paint the static grass, so I didn't pay much attention to the colour I chose, but I went for one lot of 4mm and one lot of 2mm and just mixed them together in the static grass applicator. If you haven't seen this done before, you basically put them in the static grass applicator, switch the applicator on, and then you hold the crocodile clip close to your model, give the applicator a shake, and in theory the grass gets charged and lands standing up on your model. In my experience, the best thing to do is properly cover everything, as you can see here, and then tip it upside down and shake off the excess. And if you do it over some paper towels, you can collect that excess and reuse it. This is the hillside after the first pass and the first shaking down. As you can see, there's quite a lot of glue still visible, so I'm going to give it a second pass. And that's looking much better now it's been shaken off. This is how the grass looks the next day once the glue is dry, and I think that's pretty good. I then airbrushed on some Tamiya XF52, which is flat earth, very thinly over the dirt sections, and I tried to blend slightly the edges of the grass with the path using that paint. I didn't go for 100% coverage because I want some variation in the brown colours. I then mixed up a grey using Vallejo model colour. I simply used a combination of black and white to get the grey that I wanted. And the reason I use that technique is so that I can simply add a little bit more white to get myself some highlight colours shortly. So this is the darkest grey that I'll be using, covering all the rock including these sides. And then I'm coming back having mixed a bit more white into the grey to add some highlights. They look quite stark at the moment, but once they dry they will blend in really well, and if I make them much closer to the original colour they just won't be visible in the end. I'm painting these while each layer is wet so that they do wet blend. A similar technique here except with a darker base colour and then the mid-tones and the highlights on top. And although I hadn't intended it originally, this little fold here under the grass looks a bit like an edge of a rock seam, so I painted that grey too. I still wanted some colour variation on the soil, on the path. If this was a static model, I might use some pigments, but I'm very aware that this is much more likely to get touched and moved and knocked by people walking past or by cars hitting it than your average static model. And powders, pigment powders, tend to get everywhere. So instead I'm going for a dry brush technique. This is Vallejo model colour, mostly wiped off the brush and applied simply to the raised detail by dragging the brush across it. It's quite a subtle effect, but it does make a difference. And in fact I use the same dry brush effect with a light grey colour on top of the rocks. I think really that's the main thing if you're looking for a realistic finish, is just to break up the colour. Very little in nature is a single colour. And with that in mind, I had originally decided that I was going to airbrush my static grass, but looking at it, even though it is a bit of a monotonous colour, I decided I liked it how it was and I didn't want to airbrush it at this time. I suppose I can always go back later and airbrush it, but for now I'm going to leave it as it is. It doesn't quite have that plasticky look that a lot of static grass has, so I'm fairly happy with that. Rocks also tend to have lichen and moss and things like that on them. So here I took some yellow and some green acrylic paint, thinned with a little bit of water, and I just speckled it onto those rocks to give that effect. And I'm being careful here not to get that onto the surrounding terrain. Finally, I'm really happy with the look so far, but it's perhaps not quite dirty enough. So I took some brown and green oil paints, applied them dry to the bottom of the wall next to the path, and then just gently streaked them up using some odourless thinner to give a little bit of sort of damp and dirt to the bottom of that wall. To be honest, I wasn't super happy with the initial result here. I thought that the brown was a bit too contrasty compared to the bright white wall. But things did look a bit better once I applied the green. And the way I found to really blend things in was to thin down my oil paint quite a lot with some odourless thinner, and then just go across the entire wall, speckling it on. This is kind of a dirt weathering technique that I use for military vehicles. And it just helps break up the contrast a little bit. I didn't apply any oil paint effects to the curved wall with the advertising, simply because I didn't want any oil paints on a surface that my cars might hit. And it's reasonable to think that some of these cars might crash into that barrier or end up sort of rubbing their tyres along it as they slide out. And I don't want oil paints which take a long time to dry picking up on my cars. And there we go, guys. There is my finished terrain piece for my Scalextric track. The first of several, I'm sure. Let's see what it looks like with a few figures on it. Disclaimer, these figures were painted by me about 30 years ago. They are going to be repainted. They're just here for scale at the moment. So there we go, guys. That was my terrain tutorial for my Scalextric track in 1/32 scale. Although of course most if not all of the techniques you could use in different scales in different situations. And as I said before, 1/32 is so close to 1/35 scale that basically that's where I learned all these skills, in my 1/35 scale military dioramas. I really hope you enjoyed this video, even though it's a bit different to what I normally do. As always, if you have any thoughts, either compliments or constructive criticism, then please do feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and special thanks to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. I'm going to get a few laps in now with my new terrain piece. And until the next video, thanks again for watching and have fun modelling.